The Villisca Axe Murders, a house stained with blood. It was the summer of 1912 in Villisca, Iowa town, so quiet that neighbors trusted unlocked doors and children roamed freely after dark. Yet in one single night, this tranquility was shattered, leaving behind a crime scene so brutal that it would stain the town's name forever. On the morning of June 10th, 1912, the Moore family home stood eerily silent. Curtains remained drawn, the air inside unmoving. When neighbors forced their way in, they discovered a vision of carnage that defied comprehension. 8 people, 6 of them children, slaughtered with an axe while they slept. Blood painted the walls and ceilings. Faces were unrecognizable. Every mirror and reflective surface in the house had been covered, as though the killers sought to blind the house itself. According to official records, this massacre remains unsolved to this day. But the horror is not preserved only in dusty case. File-sit lingers in whispers, in echoes of footsteps across old floorboards, in the uneasy glances of townsfolk who still lower their voices when murders are mentioned. The Villisca Axe murders were not simply a crime. They were a wound carved deep into the psyche of America's heartland. This prologue begins our journey into the house that came to be known as a place where innocence died. We will walk through the final day of the Moore family, the night of unspeakable violence, the discovery of the bodies, and the trail of suspects and failed trials that followed. We will also step into the darker corridors of folklore and fear, exploring why the Villisca house is today considered one of the most haunted locations in the United States. But first, picture the stillness of that dawn. A small town street bathed in pale light. A 2-story white house with lace curtains drawn shut, and behind those curtains, a silence heavy with death. The neighbors who entered did not just open a door, they stepped into a nightmare from which Villisca has never truly awakened. This is not merely the story of a crime scene. It is a story of broken trust, of innocence lost, of unanswered questions. It is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders, and American house forever stained with blood. The Moore family. To understand the horror of Villisca, one must first know the family whose home became a tomb. Josiah B. Moore, known to his friends as Joe, was a successful businessman in the small town. He ran a local hardware and implement store and was respected by neighbors for his honesty and hard work. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, was equally admirita, devoted mother, an active member of the Presbyterian Church. Together, they embodied the values of early 20th century small-town America: industrious, faithful, family-centered. The Moores had 4 children: Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. Herman, the eldest, was just 11 years old, a bright student with a curious mind. Catherine, at 10, was known for her gentle nature and eagerness to help her mother. Boyd, age 7, was spirited and playful, while Paul, only 5, was still the baby of the family, doted on by siblings and parents alike. The Moores' lives revolve around these children, their church, and their community. On the night of June 9th, 1912, the Moore family extended their hospitality to 2 young guests, Ina and Lena Stillinger. The Stillinger girls, aged 12 and 8, had attended the same church service as the Moores that evening and were invited to spend the night rather than walk home in the dark. It was a simple act of kindness that sealed their fate. By morning, they too would be found among the dead. The Moore home itself was typical for its, to me, a 2-story white frame house on quiet East 2nd Street. Neighbors often saw the children playing in the yard, or Sarah hanging laundry from the porch. Nothing about the house suggested tragedy. It was a place of laughter, prayer, and warmth. And perhaps that is what makes the story so unbearable. The violence that followed did not descend on strangers, but on a family woven into the fabric of their town. Friends described Josiah as a man of principle, though not without enemies. He had once worked for Frank Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and politician, before opening his own store in competition. This decision caused tension that lingered beneath the surface, feeding later suspicions. But to most, the Moores were beloved an example of decency and stability in a turbulent age. Sarah Moore was remembered for her devotion to church work, particularly in teaching Sunday school. The night of the murders, she had helped organize the Children's Day service, a lively program of songs and recitations. The Moore children performed, their voices ringing out in joy, unaware it would be the last time. The Stillinger sisters had joined as well, their laughter mingling with that of the Moores as the group walked home together beneath the darkening sky. That night, as the family and their guests settled into slumber, the house was full of innocence and exhaustion from a long day. None could imagine the evil approaching, the quiet footsteps of a killer who would turn their home into a slaughterhouse. To this day, the names of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls are recited with reverence in Villisca, reminder that the victims were not faceless figures in a case file, but living, breathing souls whose lives were cut short in the most violent way imaginable. Thus, Block 2 closes by grounding us in the humanity of the victims. Before we examine the crime itself, we must carry the weight of who was lost, a family of 6, joined by 2 visiting children, all struck down in their sleep. In Block 3, we follow the final day of their lives, the last hours of normalcy before the night of terror. The day before, June 9th, 1912, began like any other Sunday in Villisca. The town's residents woke to the familiar sounds of roosters, church bells, and the slow hum of a community preparing for worship. For the Moore family, it was a day of celebration. That evening, the Presbyterian Church hosted its annual Children's Day service, a festive occasion filled with recitations, hymns, and songs performed by the youngest members of the congregation. Sarah Moore had invested countless hours organizing the program. As the mother of 4 children and an active member of the church, she poured herself into preparing the event. Neighbors recalled her warm smile that evening, radiant with pride as she watched her children and their friends take part. The pews were packed with families, the sanctuary alive with laughter and the high voices of children performing in their Sunday best. Josiah, seated among the congregation, was equally proud. He and Sarah watched as Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul each took their turn, their small voices carrying joy through the church walls. The Stillinger sisters, Ina and Lena, were also part of the program, their parents allowing them to stay afterward with the Moores rather than make the long walk home after dark. The service ran late into the evening, and the families trickled out beneath a canopy of stars. The streets of Villisca were quiet, the occasional flicker of lantern light marking the way home. Josiah and Sarah gathered their children and the Stillinger girls, chatting pleasantly with friends before beginning the short walk back to their house. Neighbors later testified to seeing them pass, the group tired but content after a day of community celebration. By the time they reached their home on East 2nd Street, the town had gone still. Doors were locked, lamps extinguished, and the only sound was the chirping of crickets in the Iowa night. Inside the Moore house, the children prepared for bed. Catherine and Boyd shared a room, while Herman and Paul settled into another. Ina and Lena Stillinger were given the guest room downstairs. Josiah and Sarah retired to their bedroom upstairs, no doubt exhausted after the long day. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary evening in a safe and ordinary town. Yet hindsight transforms every detail into a harbinger of doom. The cheerful voices of children at church become the last echoes of innocence. The laughter on the walk home becomes a funeral march in disguise. The Moore house, which had been filled with music and joy, was on the cusp of becoming a chamber of silence and blood. According to official reports, the killer likely entered the house after the family had fallen asleep. No sign of forced entry was recorded, suggesting that the doors may have been left unlocked, a common practice in a town where trust was abundant. This single decision ordinary for the time, sealed the fate of everyone inside. Thus, Block 3 closes on the final day of normalcy for the Moores and the Stillinger girls. It was a day marked by celebration, pride, and laughter, ending with a family gathered safely in their home. In Block 4, we will follow the killer's path through that sleeping house and the unimaginable violence that unfolded under its roof. The Night of Terror, the night of June 9th into June 10th, 1912, remains one of the darkest in American true crime history. What happened within the Moore house unfolded in silence, while the town of Villisca slept unaware. According to the reconstruction pieced together by investigators, the killer entered the home sometime after midnight. Whether he slipped in while the family was still at church or after they had gone to bed remains uncertain. What is clear is that he moved with chilling purpose once inside. Evidence suggests that Josiah and Sarah Moore were the first victims. Their bedroom, located upstairs, bore the initial fury of the attack. Josiah, struck first, suffered devastating blows that left him unrecognizable. Sarah, beside him, was killed in the same manner. The force used was so great that gouges were later found in the ceiling from the upswing of the axe. A sheet had been drawn over their faces, a detail that investigators found repeated with every victim of a ritualistic act, or perhaps the killer's refusal to look at what he had done. From there, the killer moved to the children's rooms. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, aged 11 to 5, were slaughtered as they slept. The brutality spared no one, not even the youngest. Neighbors who later viewed the bodies described the scene as unbearable, the innocence of the children contrasting grotesquely with the violence visited upon them. Like their parents, the children's faces were covered after death, as though to erase their identities. Finally, the killer descended the stairs to the guest room, where Ina and Lena Stillinger lay. Ina, just 8 years old, was dispatched in the same merciless fashion. Lena, 12, bore signs of having been awake at the time of the attack. Defensive wounds on her arms suggested she had struggled, and her position on the bed indicated she may have seen the killer before the final blow fell. This detail would haunt investigators, as it hinted at the only moment of resistance in an otherwise silent massacre. By dawn, 8 people lay dead within the small white house. Every mirror and reflective surface had been covered, and pieces of clothing were draped over windows as if to block the gaze of the outside world. A slab of bacon, oddly, was found beside the axe, perhaps intended for use, or left as a grotesque token. The killer, whoever he was, lingered long enough to eat a meal from the Moore's kitchen before disappearing into the night. No one saw him leave. According to official records, there were no signs of robbery or theft. Money and valuables remained untouched. The motive, if there was one, was not material gain, but something darker, something that spoke of rage, ritual, or madness. The precision of the killings, the covering of faces, the strange details left behind all painted a picture not of random violence, but of deliberate, chilling design. Thus, Block 4 closes with the house transformed from a place of laughter to a slaughterhouse of silence. The victims lay where they had fallen, and the killer vanished into history, leaving behind a mystery that endures more than a century later. In Block 5, we will follow the morning discovery of the bodies and the shock that rippled through the unsuspecting town of Villisca. Discovery of the bodies. The morning of June 10th, 1912, dawned like any other in Villisca, Iowa. Neighbors went about their routines, yet unease slowly spread when the Moore family did not appear to begin their daily chores. Sarah Moore was known to rise early, and the children were usually outside by mid-morning. That day, the house remained silent. Blinds were drawn tight, and no voices carried through the windows. Something was wrong. By 7:30 a.m., Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, grew concerned. She approached the house, knocked on the door, and received no reply. She tried the handle, but the door was locked. Alarmed, She called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who arrived shortly after with his spare key. Together, they entered the house, stepping into a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. The first room they checked was the guest bedroom. There, they discovered the bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger. Bloodied bedclothes and the motionless forms of the girls confirmed their worst fears. Ross, shaken to his core, urged Mary to call the town's marshal. Marshal Hank Horton arrived quickly, but what awaited him inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. Room by room, the horror revealed itself. Horton found Josiah and Sarah in their bed upstairs, their faces covered and the walls above streaked with blood. The children were next, each in their beds, each slaughtered. The silence of the house was broken only by the marshal's horrified gasps and the murmurs of neighbors gathering outside. Word spread rapidly, and within hours, a crowd formed on East 2nd Street, drawn by morbid curiosity and disbelief. According to official accounts, the scene quickly descended into chaos. Law enforcement struggled to contain the swelling number of townspeople who pushed their way inside. As many as 100 individuals reportedly wandered through the Moore home that day, contaminating evidence, touching objects, and leaving behind footprints. One man even removed fragments of Josiah's skull as a macabre souvenir. In hindsight, these actions destroyed the integrity of the crime scene, crippling any chance at solving the murders through forensic science. Doctors were summoned, and their examination confirmed the brutality. Each victim had been struck repeatedly in the head, the force of the blows leaving little doubt about the killer's rage. The covering of the faces, the draping of clothing over mirrors, and the peculiar discovery of food left uneaten in the kitchen hinted at ritual or calculation rather than spontaneous violence. No valuables were taken. The motive remained as elusive as the killer. The shock that gripped Villisca was profound. This was a town where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors trusted one another implicitly. The murders shattered that trust overnight. Parents clutched their children tightly. Husbands barred doors, and whispers of the devil himself circulated among the faithful. The town would never feel safe again. Thus, Block 5 closes on the moment Villisca lost its innocence. What began as an ordinary Monday morning transformed into the day the town was branded forever. 8 lives ended in silence, and a community was thrust into chaos. In Block 6, we will step deeper into the crime scene itself, examining the disturbing details left behind by the killer. The crime scene. The crime scene inside the Moore house was unlike anything the small-town law enforcement of Villisca had ever faced. Even seasoned doctors and investigators were shaken by the grotesque details. What they encountered was not merely evidence of murder, it was the anatomy of a nightmare. The house bore signs of calculated violence. Curtains had been drawn tightly across every window, and clothing or linens had been draped over mirrors and reflective surfaces. Some investigators speculated that the killer could not bear to see his own reflection in the aftermath of such brutality. Others suggested it was part of a ritual, a deliberate attempt to blind the house itself from witnessing what had taken place. The weapon axe was discovered inside the house, leaning against a wall. It was identified as belonging to Josiah Moore himself, taken from the family's woodshed. That the killer had chosen a weapon from within the home rather than bringing his own suggested premeditation of a different sort, a willingness to improvise, to use what was at hand. The axe was stained with blood and hair, mute testimony to the savagery of the night. Blood spatter told a gruesome story. The walls and ceilings bore arcs and smears from repeated blows, some so high they revealed the sheer force behind each strike. In Josiah and Sarah's room, gouges in the ceiling indicated that the upswing of the axe had struck wood, leaving deep scars that lingered long after the cleanup. Each child's bed carried not just the marks of death, but the strange, haunting image of faces covered post-mortem pillowcases, sheets, or clothing pulled over them. This detail gave the scene a chilling uniformity, as though the killer followed a personal code. Another unsettling discovery was the presence of a plate of uneaten food on the kitchen table. Investigators found a bowl of water clouded with blood, suggesting that the killer had lingered after the murders, washing his hands before departing. The thought that he had paused to eat or at least prepare a meal in the very house where 8 bodies lay upstairs filled the community with horror. Even stranger was the slab of bacon found leaning against the wall near the axe. A second piece of bacon was discovered in the icebox, wrapped in cloth. Theories abounded. Was it a fetish object, part of some ritual, or simply the product of a disturbed mind? No explanation satisfied the investigators, but the bizarre detail clung to the case, making the crime even more incomprehensible. According to official records, the footprints and fingerprints that might have revealed the killer's identity were compromised almost immediately. The flood of townspeople into the house curiosity seekers who trampled through the rooms obliterated any chance of gathering reliable evidence. Bloodied handprints that may have belonged to the murderer were dismissed as contaminated, and crucial clues were lost forever. The atmosphere inside the house was described by those present as suffocating, heavy with the smell of iron and decay. Doctors later confessed that they struggled to concentrate on their examinations, overwhelmed by the sheer brutality. The marshal admitted that it was the most horrifying scene he had ever encountered in his career, a crime so unnatural that words failed him. Thus, Block 6 closes with the realization that the crime scene offered not clarity, but confusion. Every detail covered faces, drawn curtains, uneaten food, slabs of bacon-added layers of strangeness rather than explanation. In Block 7, we will focus on the axe itself, the weapon that became both the instrument of death and the single most tangible clue left behind by the killer. The axe itself. Among all the strange and haunting details of the Villisca murders, none is as central as the axe itself. It was both a tool of everyday rural life and, on that night, an instrument of unimaginable horror. The axe belonged to Josiah Moore. Investigators confirmed that it had been taken from the family's woodshed, a chilling reminder that the weapon of destruction had come from within the victim's own household. The axe was found propped against a wall in a room where Josiah and Sarah had been slain. Its blade and handle were coated in blood and hair, though by the time investigators examined it, the contamination of the scene had compromised its value as evidence. At the time, fingerprinting was still an emerging science in the United States, and the haphazard handling of the crime scene meant that the axe's potential as forensic proof was wasted. The presence of the weapon raised disturbing questions. Why would a killer bring no weapon of his own, relying instead on what he found in the Moore household? Some argued that this detail indicated spontaneity, that the murders were not planned but erupted from a sudden burst of violence. Others suggested the opposite, that the killer knew the house well enough to rely on finding an axe there, or that he wanted to leave a deliberate message by using the family's own property against them. The axe also told a story through the wounds it inflicted. Doctors who examined the victims noted the extreme force with which it had been used. Some blows were delivered with a blunt end, crushing skulls rather than slicing them. Others bore the sharp edge's mark, splitting bone cleanly. The alternating use of blunt and sharp suggested either frenzy or a perverse ritual. The ceiling above Josiah and Sarah's bed, marked with deep gouges, spoke to the killer's unrelenting savagery, each swing powered by rage or madness. One of the most unsettling aspects was the killer's decision to leave the weapon behind. Most murderers, especially those who strike in secrecy, take care to remove or conceal evidence. Here, the axe remained in plain sight, as though the killer had no fear of discovery or perhaps wanted the community to see it. Some theorized that leaving the weapon was part of the message, a symbol of dominance, a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of every household in Villisca. In later years, the axe would become an object of grim fascination. Reporters and townspeople alike recounted how its presence in the home seemed to radiate dread, as though the wood and steel carried the memory of the night's horrors. When it was finally removed, the house did not lose its aura of violence. Instead, the absence of the weapon only deepened the mystery, leaving behind unanswered questions. According to some unofficial accounts, the axe was displayed as evidence in subsequent trials, its blood-stained form shocking juries and the public alike. But it never yielded the identity of the killer. No fingerprints, no confessions, no definitive link to any suspect ever emerged from the blade. It became not just a murder weapon, but a symbol of the case's feudalicious silent witness to a crime that defied resolution. Thus, Block 7 ends with the axe standing as both the most tangible and the most useless piece of evidence in the Villisca murders. It carried the weight of 8 lives lost, yet offered no path to justice. In Block 8, we will turn to the suspects, the men whose names were whispered in kitchens and shouted in courtrooms, each accused of carrying the burden of the axe, though none ever condemned with certainty. The suspects. In the wake of the Villisca Axe murders, suspicion fell upon more than one figure. The brutality of the crime demanded an explanation, and the community, desperate for justice, began to cast about for someone to blame. Over the years, several men were accused, interrogated, and even tried, but none were ever convicted. Each suspect brought his own tangle of motives, rumors, and shadows. The first and most prominent name whispered through Villisca was that of Frank Jones, a wealthy businessman and state senator. Jones had once employed Josiah Moore in his hardware business, but their relationship soured when Moore left to open his own store. The rivalry deepened when Moore allegedly lured away a major business account from Jones, and rumors swirled about Moore's possible involvement with Jonas' daughter-in-law. Some believe Jones harbored such deep resentment that he arranged the murders, perhaps hiring someone to carry them out. Yet no direct evidence ever tied him to the crime, and his political power shielded him from serious prosecution. Another leading suspect was George Kelly, an itinerant preacher from England who had passed through Villisca around the time of the murders. Kelly was described as eccentric and socially awkward, with a history of erratic behavior. He attended the Children's Day service the night before the murders and reportedly showed an unusual interest in the Moore family. Kelly later confessed to the killings, but his confession was inconsistent, riddled with contradictions, and ultimately dismissed as unreliable. He was tried twice, the first ending in a hung jury and the second in acquittal. Despite his oddities, Kelly walked free. Other names emerged in the swirl of suspicion. Some townspeople pointed to transient workers or vagrants passing through by rail. The Midwest in 1912 was rife with drifters, and the ease with which strangers came and went lent plausibility to the idea of an unknown outsider striking at random. Yet the details of the crime, the drawn curtains, the lingering in the house, the covering of faces suggested more than a passing stranger's frenzy. Some investigators considered the possibility of a serial killer. Across the Midwest, reports of eerily similar axe murders surfaced around the same time. Families slain in their sleep, weapons left behind, and ritualistic details bore striking resemblances to Villisca. Could the Moore family have fallen victim to a murderer who roamed from town to town, leaving shattered households in his wake? The theory gained traction, but was never conclusively proven. There are even whispers of townsfolk themselves. The notion that someone within Villisca could have committed the murders haunted the community. Was it a jealous lover, a business rival, or a deeply disturbed individual hiding in plain sight? The lack of forced entry suggested the killer may have been familiar with the family or trusted enough to enter unnoticed. But again, no proof emerged. According to official records, The investigation was hampered not only by the contamination of the crime scene, but also by small-town politics and personal biases. Each suspect brought with him a plausible story, but none brought closure. The result was a widening circle of suspicion that poisoned relationships and deepened the wound already inflicted by the murders. Thus, Block 8 closes on the unsettling truth. Villisca never found its killer. Whether it was a powerful rival, a wandering preacher, a faceless drifter, or a serial killer moving silently across state lines, the identity of the murderer remained locked in shadows. In Block 9, we will step into the courtrooms and examine the trials that followed the faltering attempts of the justice system to name a culprit and the failures that left the case forever unresolved. Trials and failures. The Villisca Axe Murders demanded justice, but when the wheels of the legal system began to turn, they did so slowly and clumsily. In the years following the massacre, the community's hunger for closure fueled investigations, indictments, and trials, yet each ended in disappointment. The failures of these proceedings deepened the mystery and cemented Villisca's fate as a place of unanswered questions. The first major trial centered on Reverend George Kelly, the eccentric English-born preacher. Kelly's strange behavior before and after the murders made him an object of suspicion. He had attended the Children's Day service on June 9th and was seen watching the Moore family closely. In the days following the murders, Kelly reportedly spoke of the crime with unsettling familiarity, as though he knew details that had not been released. Years later, he even confessed to the killings, but his confession was contradictory, shifting under scrutiny. Kelly described scenes inaccurately, misstated details of the house, and altered his story multiple times. His fragile mental state only further undermined credibility. Despite this, prosecutors pressed forward, desperate for a conviction. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was brought to trial. The proceedings captivated the nation, drawing reporters from across the Midwest. The prosecution painted Kelly as a disturbed man, obsessed with sex and religion, whose twisted impulses had driven him to slaughter the Moores and the Stillinger girls. The defense, however, emphasized the inconsistencies of his confession and his long history of mental illness. The first trial ended in a hung jury. A second trial followed, and this time Kelly was acquitted. The verdict was final. George Kelly, strange though he was, would not be the man legally blamed for Villisca. Other suspects were considered, but none were ever successfully tried. Frank Jones, the powerful businessman and politician, was dogged by rumors of involvement, yet no indictment was ever secured against him. His influence and standing in the community seemed to place him beyond the reach of justice. Meanwhile, the idea of a wandering serial killer, responsible for multiple axe murders across the Midwest, remained just theta theory, with no courtroom reckoning. The trials revealed the weaknesses of early 20th century law enforcement and forensic science. The crime scene had been hopelessly contaminated, witness testimony was inconsistent, and confessions were unreliable. Prosecutors struggled to build coherent cases, and defense attorneys easily dismantled what little evidence was presented. The result was a cycle of accusation and acquittal that left the victims without justice and the town without peace. According to official records, the cost of these legal failures was more than financial. The endless speculation poisoned relationships within Villisca. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, friendships dissolved, and the town's once solid trust was replaced with paranoia. The courthouse became a stage where grief was prolonged rather than resolved, and each acquittal only reopened the wound. Thus, Block 9 closes on the futility of justice in Villisca. Trials were held, suspects named, and accusations shouted, yet the truth remained elusive. The legal system failed to provide closure, and the mystery only deepened. In Block 10, we will turn from the courtroom to the realm of speculation theories of motive that range from jealousy and revenge to madness and ritual, each seeking to explain the inexplicable. Theories of motive. If the killer's identity was never confirmed, perhaps understanding his motive could bring clarity. Yet the Villisca murders resist even this. Theories of motive have swirled for more than a century, ranging from the plausible to the bizarre, each attempting to explain why 8 lives were ended so brutally on that June night in 1912. One of the most common theories centered on revenge. Josiah Moore had made enemies in Villisca, particularly Frank Jones, his former employer and political rival. The idea that Jones orchestrated the murders out of jealousy, anger, or humiliation persisted for decades. Jonas' political ambitions and rumored resentment of Moore provided a compelling narrative, though no evidence ever substantiated it. Still, for many, revenge remains the simplest explanation. Another theory suggested jealousy of a more intimate kind. Rumors whispered that Josiah Moore had been romantically involved with Jonas' daughter-in-law, an indiscretion that could have sparked a deadly vendetta. While such claims remained speculative, they fueled gossip and provided townsfolk with a human motive that fit their understanding of passion and violence. Others pointed to madness as the only possible motive. The sheer brutality of the killings, the covering of faces, the lingering in the house afterward all suggested the work of a deeply disturbed mind. Whether George Kelly, with his erratic behavior, or another drifter with violent impulses, the act seemed to many to be rooted not in reason, but in insanity. Madness, however, is a convenient explanation that explains everything and nothing at once. Some investigators entertain the possibility of ritual or symbolism. The careful covering of mirrors, the post-mortem draping of faces, and a strange placement of bacon slabs all hinted at meaning beyond mere violence. Was the killer enacting a ritual of purification or concealment? Was he following some private code or superstition? Such theories remain speculative but highlight the unsettling strangeness of the scene. Another disturbing possibility was sexual motive. Lena Stillinger, the 12-year-old guest, bore signs of having been awake during the attack, and her body suggested possible sexual assault or staging meant to imply it. This fueled theories that lust or deviance played a role in the murders, adding a further layer of horror to the crime. Yet, as with every other theory, definitive evidence was lacking. Then there was the theory of the traveling serial killer. Across the Midwest, during the same era, similar axe murders were reported. Families slaughtered in their beds, weapons left at the scene, ritualistic elements repeated. These patterns seemed too similar to ignore. Some criminologists argue that Villisca was one stop in a string of murders committed by the same elusive figure. If true, the motive was not personal, but compulsively a killer driven to repeat his crimes across state lines, vanishing before law enforcement could connect the dots. According to official records, none of these theories ever rose above conjecture. No confession, no evidence, no proof tied motive to murderer. Instead, Villisca was left with a catalog of possibilities: revenge, jealousy, madness, ritual, lust, or compulsion. Each theory made sense in part, yet none could explain the totality of the crime. Thus, Block 10 closes on the enduring frustration of the case. The motives, like the killer himself, remain cloaked in shadow. In Block 11, we will turn from speculation to further investigation, stage confrontations, experiments, and modern attempts to draw truth from the silence of the Villisca Axe Murder House. Experiments and stage confrontations. As the years passed and no conviction was secured, frustration with the Villisca case grew. Authorities and private investigators alike turned to unusual methods, desperate to prove theories or force confessions. The result was a series of experiments and stage confrontations that bordered on the theatrical, reflecting the town's obsession with the murders. One of the earliest attempts involved recreating the killer's path through the Moore house. Investigators brought in witnesses, measured distances, and staged mock demonstrations of how the killer might have moved silently from room to room. They speculated about the sequence of blows, the order of the victims, and the possibility that multiple killers were involved. But without reliable forensic evidence, the reconstructions amounted to little more than grim speculation. In later years, George Kelly himself became the subject of bizarre, staged confrontations. Detectives, convinced of his guilt, arranged interrogations designed to break him down. Kelly's fragile mental state made him a pliable subject, and under pressure he confessed not once, but several times. Yet each confession unraveled under scrutiny, contradicted by physical facts or Kelly's own inconsistencies. The attempts to stage his guilt ultimately undermined the case against him. Some investigators tried psychological experiments, probing the minds of suspects to detect deception. They asked suspects to walk through the house, to look at the blood-stained rooms, and react. The idea was that a guilty man could not mask his horror or guilt when confronted with the scene. But such confrontations revealed nothing certain. Both guilty and innocent could shudder in the face of such carnage. Unofficial experiments also flourished. Journalists, amateur sleuths, and even spiritualists entered the house seeking answers. Some attempted seances, hoping to contact the spirits of the dead for clues. Others examined the architecture of the house itself, looking for hidden passages or evidence of prior break-ins. These endeavors often generated headlines, but no clarity. Perhaps the most damaging stage confrontation was the courtroom itself. Prosecutors, lacking hard evidence, leaned heavily on spectacle. They displayed the bloodied axe, showed jurors gruesome photographs, and recited the horror in lurid detail. They hoped emotion would substitute for proof. Defense attorneys countered by exposing the weaknesses of the evidence and the theatrics of the prosecution. The trials became performances, each side staging their version of the truth, while the real truth slipped further away. According to official accounts, these experiments and stage confrontations revealed more about the desperation of investigators than about the killer himself. The lack of reliable evidence meant that every attempt was built on sand. Theories could not be tested, confessions could not be trusted, and experiments could not withstand scrutiny. The result was a cycle of hope and disappointment that eroded the community's faith in justice. Thus, Block 11 closes on the image of a town and a legal system chasing shadows. The experiments brought no answers, only more confusion. In Block 12, we will explore the strange disappearance of records, maps, and files documents that might have preserved clarity but instead vanished, feeding the legend that some truths were buried deliberately. Missing maps, buried records, and lost files. The Villisca Axe murders were not only marked by brutality, but also by the strange fate of the records surrounding the case. Over time, key documents vanished, maps, files, and investigative notes that should have been preserved as part of the official record. Their disappearance fueled suspicion that the truth about the murders was not merely elusive, but deliberately obscured. According to early investigators, detailed maps of the crime scene were drawn, showing the positions of bodies, the trajectory of blows, and the peculiar placement of objects like the slabs of bacon and the covered mirrors. Yet decades later, these maps could not be found in any archive. Some speculated they had been lost through negligence, while others whispered they had been destroyed to protect powerful interests. Case files, too, suffered a similar fate. Reports that once existed in county records mysteriously disappeared. Sheriff's notes, coroner's findings, and witness statements were either misplaced or buried so deeply they might as well have been erased. Journalists who attempted to revisit the evidence found themselves confronted with gaps, missing transcripts, incomplete testimonies, and empty folders where documents should have been. It was as though history itself had conspired to blur the details of Villisca. Some researchers pointed to political corruption. Frank Jones, long rumored to have had a motive for orchestrating the murders, was a man of considerable power. Did his influence reach into the courthouse and the archives? Could records that might have implicated him have been deliberately destroyed? The possibility was never proven, but the suspicion persisted. Others suggested that the incompetence of small-town officials, overwhelmed by the scale of the crime, led to the careless loss of critical evidence. The disappearance of documents also opened the door to conspiracy theories. Was the Villisca case part of a larger pattern of axe murders across the Midwest? And were records suppressed to prevent panic? Was there an effort to conceal the identity of a serial killer whose trail stretched across state lines? Or did the vanishing files simply reflect the chaos of 1912, when evidence preservation was far from the science it is today? What is certain is that the missing records crippled later efforts to solve the crime. Without maps, investigators could not fully reconstruct the scene. Without files, they could not trace the chain of custody of evidence or revisit testimony with modern techniques. The gaps in the record became as much a part of the legend as the murders themselves. For some, the lost documents suggested that Villisca was never meant to have closure. Truth, if it existed in ink and paper, had been buried alongside the victims. This sense of deliberate erasure fed the notion that the house was cursed not only by blood, but by silent silence imposed by human hands as well as by the unknown. Thus, Block 12 closes with the unsettling image of empty archives and vanished files. The absence of records is itself a haunting presence, leaving behind only speculation. In Block 13, we will turn from lost papers to lingering sounds of voices in the silence of the Villisca Axe Murder House, where modern visitors claim to hear echoes of the dead. Voices in the silence audio phenomena. If the physical evidence of the Villisca Axe murders was compromised or lost, the echoes that linger within the house have become the focus of modern investigators. For decades, visitors and paranormal researchers have reported a strange phenomenon: the sound of voices in the silence, whispers that carry no human source, and footsteps that echo across empty floors. Those who have spent the night in the house describe the atmosphere as heavy, as though the air itself remembers. Electronic voice phenomena, EVP, recordings have captured faint words, sometimes names, sometimes pleas, sometimes indistinguishable murmurs. Skeptics argue that these are the byproduct of faulty equipment or the suggestible human mind. But to those who have heard them directly, the voices feel like the house speaking back. One of the most chilling reports comes from investigators who claim to have recorded a child's laughter in the upstairs bedrooms, long after midnight when the house was otherwise still. Others speak of women's sobs, echoing faintly through the kitchen, or men's heavy footsteps pacing in the attic where, some speculate, the killer may have waited for the family to fall asleep. These sounds defy easy explanation, but they persist in account after account. According to official paranormal investigations, the Villisca Axe Murder House ranks among the most active sites in the United States. Teams equipped with recorders, cameras, and sensors frequently emerge with unexplained data fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, temperature drops, and audio anomalies. The house seems to respond not only to presence, but to provocation. Those who call out the names of the Moore family or the Stillinger girls sometimes report answers, faint but unmistakable. Some researchers suggest that the phenomena are a form of residual haunting, an imprint of trauma so profound that it repeats endlessly, like grooves worn into the fabric of time. Others argue for intelligent spirits, voices of the victims, or even the killer himself, still trapped within the walls where blood was spilled. Theories diverge, but the experiences remain eerily consistent. Visitors unprepared for the intensity of the house often leave shaken. Reports describe guests fleeing in the night, unable to bear the feeling of being watched, or the sudden onset of dread when footsteps sound on the stairs. Tour guides tell of strong men reduced to tears, convinced they had heard the voices of children calling their names. The silence of Villisca is rarely empty. It is filled with echoes that should not exist. Skeptics, of course, dismiss these accounts. They argue that the power of suggestion, the creaks of an old house, and the human mind's tendency to seek patterns explain the phenomena. Yet even skeptics admit the sheer volume of reports collected across decades is difficult to ignore. When dozens of unrelated individuals describe the same laughter, the same sobbing, the same footsteps, coincidence begins to seem less plausible. Thus, Block 13 closes with the voices in the silence of the Villisca Axe Murder House. Whether they are echoes of the past, restless spirits, or tricks of perception, they add another layer of unease to an already horrifying story. In Block 14, we will step into the present day, exploring how the house has become a museum, a tourist attraction, and a site of living legend. The Villisca Axe Murder House today. More than a century has passed since the Villisca Axe Murders, yet the small white house on East 2nd Street still stands. Today, it is no ordinary residence, but a monument to tragedy, one of the most infamous crime scenes in America, preserved as both museum and haunted attraction. The Villisca Axe Murder House has been restored to resemble its 1912 appearance. Visitors who enter are greeted not with the comforts of modernity, but with the stark simplicity of early 20th century life. The walls are bare, the furnishings are replicas of what the Moore family might have known, and the air feels thick with history. For some, it is a somber memorial. For others, it is an opportunity to walk into the pages of true crime legend. Tours of the house attract thousands each year. Daytime tours focus on the historical record, the lives of the Moores, the night of the murders, the failed investigations, and the legacy of unanswered questions. Guides recount the details with reverence, careful to remind visitors that 8 innocent people died within these walls. Yet as evening falls, the atmosphere shifts. Overnight stays are offered for those brave enough to confront the house in darkness. It is during these night vigils that the house reveals its reputation as one of the most haunted locations in the United States. Guests bring recorders, cameras, and ghost hunting equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal. Many leave with stories, the sound of footsteps across the upstairs hallway, whispers near the children's rooms, or sudden cold drafts in the kitchen. Some claim to have seen shadows move, or felt unseen hands brush against them. A few flee before dawn, unable to endure the intensity of the experience. The house has been featured in numerous television programs and documentaries, from ghost adventures to most terrifying places in America. Each portrayal emphasizes the strange energy that clings to the house, the sense that it remembers. Skeptics dismiss these claims as theatrics, arguing that the notoriety of the murders alone shapes visitors' imaginations. But even skeptics admit that there is something profoundly unsettling about standing in the bedrooms where the Moore children were slain. For the town of Villisca, the house is both a burden and a source of livelihood. Tourism has brought attention and revenue, yet has also cemented the town's identity as a place forever linked to bloodshed. Some residents resent the constant fascination, while others embrace it as part of history that cannot be erased. The dual role of the house as crime scene and attraction reflects this tension. According to official tourism records, thousands of people have crossed the threshold of the Villisca Axe Murder House, yet the questions they carry out are the same as those that haunted the town in 1912. Who killed the Moores and the Stillinger girls? Why were the faces covered, the mirrors draped, the weapon left behind? The house offers no answers, only the weight of silence and the echoes of the past. Thus, Block 14 closes with the present face of Villisca, a house preserved in tragedy, a site of pilgrimage for believers and skeptics alike. In Block 15, we will bring our journey to its end, reflecting on how the murders have endured in American memory, and why the house remains a place where history, horror, and legend walk side by side. A house stained forever. Every story seeks an ending, but the tale of the Villisca Axe Murders refuses to close. The house still stands, silent and watching, and the blood that soaked its walls continues to color the imagination of all who enter. This is not just his story, it is legend, trauma, and haunting entwined into one. According to official records, the case remains unsolved. No killer was ever named with certainty, no motive confirmed, no justice delivered. Instead, the murders became an open wound in America's heartland, one that never fully healed. Families locked their doors, small towns lost their innocence, and Villisca itself became synonymous with dread. The house has endured as a reminder of questions without answers. Who crept through its halls that night, axe in hand? Why were the victims' faces covered? Why did the killer linger, eating food and washing in the kitchen, as though unafraid of discovery? These mysteries remain, circling endlessly like whispers in the silence. Some believe the answers lie buried with lost files and corrupted investigations. Others say the house itself holds the truth etched into its beams and floorboards. But perhaps the true legacy of Villisca is not in finding answers, but in confronting what it represents: the fragility of safety, the randomness of violence, and the way tragedy lingers long after the blood is cleaned. The house is not haunted merely by spirits, it is haunted by our need for meaning, our refusal to accept that some horrors have no resolution. Visitors who stand in the bedrooms where children were slaughtered often speak of an overwhelming feeling, not always of fear, but of sorrow. It is as though the walls themselves grieve, carrying echoes of laughter cut short. Some leave convinced they have encountered the supernatural. Others leave with a more sobering realization that evil can walk silently into any home, in any town, without warning. Thus, Block 15 closes not with clarity, but with unease. The Villisca Axe Murder House remains a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the brave, a site where history, crime, and the paranormal collide. The story endures because it cannot be explained, because it leaves more questions than answers. And perhaps that is the truest horror, that more than a century later, the axe still casts its shadow. The house in Villisca is stained forever, not just with blood, but with memory, mystery, and silence that will never fade.